And boy, it's great when you can come to a conference and we talk about a 30-minute presentation being the short one. Let me know if you can see that. Great. Okay, so many of you here may remember some of this work that Annalise and Fritz and others have been working on with Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, doing what we're calling direct seeding. And what I wanted to do today was share a little bit about a success story we had with a project that Annalise is doing, but also to give you an update on how we're coordinating this now, because I think what we've really learned is that this story today is not necessarily what we had hoped to report back 7 years ago when we started. Rather, it's a story of learning from our experiences that we've had. I'm constantly reminded not to call them failures, but rather learning experiences. Thank you, Fritz. And recognizing the need to develop more capacity that will assist the conservation efforts on many levels. Our hope isn't just to restore hayfields to floodplain forest, but also to assist with seed sourcing, collection, processing, and storing for nursery stock and any other conservation efforts that could use woody stem seed or shrub seed, riparian seed as we refer to it. So what we want to share today is not only a local success story of Annalise's project, but also to ask for your participation in a method that we think has merit, and to share with you that we are working really hard to find and fund capacity to not only grow this direct seeding methodology and learn from it, but also to fund nursery capacity and monitoring capacity, two things that we really feel have been identified as lacking statewide. So most of our, when I say our learning experiences or failures, to be honest, haven't been in the test of whether or not this process works. We all know that if you have prepared soils and seed falls on it, and you have enough moisture and enough sunlight and warmth, and the seeds are viable, that you're going to get a forest. It's not something that we really feel like we need to educate anyone on. Trees grow from seeds. What we failed at was understanding the complexity of gathering, storing, and then sowing the seed during these changing times when we've had really dry springs. June is when most of the seed flies in the spring, and it's been landing on prepared soil that might as well be landing on concrete. We've also been dealing with earlier winters than we were expecting when it comes time to prepare the soils in the fall, an area that there's a narrow window that we really have tried to learn what the sweet spot really is. So by partnering and gathering grant funding, we think we'll be able to weather all these different storms and really dig into the solution to floodplain forest restoration. So I just want to go through a few slides here that are identifying and addressing sort of our streamlining process. And then I'm going to take a few minutes to share with you some stuff that Annalise has prepared earlier when she thought she was going to be here. So as we said, we have some challenges. We have challenges with preparation. We have these really narrow windows for collecting and processing the seed. You can collect all the seed you want and store it, but if you don't process it really quickly, it just rots in a bucket or in a bag. There's this awareness that we have a big state and seeds are germinating and growing and ripening at a different day or a different period in different parts of the states. And so racing around trying to collect this diverse seed set has been a struggle. And then there's this staffing issue. We all have been doing this kind of as our second job. Fritz is not a seed collector, but he's been kind of running around with us trying to identify seed sites. Northwoods was never really supposed to be doing all the work that they've had to do in short windows. And I certainly have been very busy during those core periods. So we learned that capacity of staffing was an issue. And then we know that monitoring has been a struggle as well, because we're not full-time. We don't have the staff to kind of drive all over the state where we're doing these projects and monitor the conditions and when to put it down and then actually how well it's working. So the solutions to all these problems is more money, more people, right? So what we've plan on doing is for starters, when it comes to preparing for seed collection, we have Northwood's staff and a full-time Northwood staff that's really going to make this a priority of their role. And that was grant funded through the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission to hire a staff there, and then 2 more staff that I think you heard Meg talk about earlier today that are going to be helping with a lot of the collection. So when it comes to the spatial awareness and the scope of the statewide seed collection, we're in the process right now of developing a grant to hire someone that we're calling a seed coordinator statewide. So there are a lot of organizations that are working on this, but we really want to work closely to help out the Intervale, and a position that they really needed anyways, that Annalise at one point was kind of recruited into, but not full time. And so we really feel like this is a role that needs to be funded full time. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Vermont Fish and Wildlife both have grants through the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, and we want to use some of that grant money to hire a full-time staff that hopefully is going to be working at the Intervale. There's more news on that. We think that process is coming together, but we're not 100% certain. But they'll be coordinating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Northwoods, the Connecticut River Conservancy, probably the Nature Conservancy, and anyone else that wants to partner on this project. And the staffing, we do have some grant funding, Northwoods, of course, and we think the Intervale will probably also, have a crew that'll be available in limited periods of time to do seed collection on a statewide, not just individually for their organization. And Northwoods isn't just doing it for our projects, but trying to pool our resources so that we have a larger store of seeds statewide that's available for whatever conservation efforts we're planning. And then finally, this monitoring piece, which we're working with the Connecticut River Conservancy and the White River Partnership to staff someone that will look at not just monitoring the direct seeding projects, but also tree planting projects, which we feel like there's been a piece missing there. We've applied for a few grants over the years and not gotten them. And now we finally decided that it's probably a good place for this Great Lakes Fisheries Commission money to go. So that to me is kind of our big announcement. We're really trying to work with the funding that we have right now, and there's a lot coming. There's a lot of money out there, and just finding the right grants that will actually allow us to hire staff to do things that are project development rather than just implementation, where I think a lot of the money is. So specifically for seed collection, we used to be very focused on, just a few species: silver maple, cottonwood, willow, and oak. Silver maple you can't store. That's just a fact. You can collect it off the ground, and boy, you better get it out there really quickly, because it's not going to store in a freezer or in a refrigerator. It's going to germinate very quickly. Cottonwood and willow, man, well, there's a bag. This photo is showing some aspen. And looks just like cottonwood. It's the same idea. That's really fluffy stuff. What a pain to harvest and collect and store. It's been kind of a nightmare. So we've realized now that we really need these people around, and I think I already shared with you the solutions that we have. But also, we're not just going to focus on these few species. We're also going to look at fall dropping species and start looking at some of the nuts and berries and all the different tree species that we have out there. And we've started that already. We have quite a store of a variety of seeds, and we're working with Northern Vermont University to help us ensure that the seed that we've collected is actually viable. Oops. Here's where we started the first year when we were collecting. These are willow, and we'd go out and collect them right before they started to open up, and then we'd bring them inside and try to dry them. First, we'd pick off the stems, and then we would start to expose them to heat and light, and then the pods would open up and the fluff would start coming out, and the office space that we were using became unlivable. It was like walking through a dandelion forest right when they were all going to seed every time you open the door in there. So we've just discovered the hard way that this is something that we need to do better at, and we're on the way. We're now looking for a facility to help process it, and we've got a lot more equipment and some drying racks, and we've worked with some places like the Saratoga Tree Nursery, which is part of the New York DEC, where they can help us process it, they can help educate us, but they're not allowed to sell us the seed. It's something that's built into their mission back in the late 1800s, early 1900s when they were founded. So we've realized that if we want to do this, we have to learn how to do it and do it ourselves and do it well. And so this is what we're working on right now, is not only increasing our seed collection abilities, but our processing abilities. And then finally, this storage, which includes testing the seeds to make sure they're viable, so that we're not just putting all this stuff in the freezer and the refrigerator only to have it go bad. So working with NVU on that and determining the need with this coordinator position in advance, so that we can start to store these large volumes of a variety of seeds and then have them available for partners that are interested in this kind of project, as well as nurseries when they're in a pinch statewide. So this is truly meant to be, this project is meant to be a partnership, and we can help facilitate that with the grant money that we have. So to give a little update on what we plan on doing this year and next year, is hitting the reset at La Platte Headwaters Town Forest in Heinsberg, which is what these photos are of, where we've had some good success with the bare earth, but we've had very poor success with the hydro seeding results. We were able to get quite a lot of oak to germinate with acorns, but we haven't really come up with a good method to spread those acorns yet. Right now, it's literally poking them in the ground one at a time. So a process that we're working on this fall. And also at the Johnson Farm Wildlife Management Area on the Connecticut River, this is a project that Fritz helped develop, and that we're doing about a 10-acre parcel there, where we need a lot of seed, and we're really working on restoring silver maple and probably some other species that we've collected locally at Johnson Farm. So those are our two big projects for this fall to get ready for next spring and potentially for this fall. And then we want to start working in Wolcott on a property that is a Lamoille stream bank management area that is owned and managed by the Fisheries Division of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we want to prep that this fall and get ready to plant it in the spring, as well as plant trees on top of it, where we want to show that we can do both of these at the same time. It doesn't need to be one or the other, they can work together. And then we want to expand our previous project in Barton, and then start really using this year as our year to determine whether or not we can do spring plantings at all by practicing with some irrigation systems. Small scale, but something that could work in a few acre parcel. So I'm going to stop sharing really quickly while I line up the next talk. Bear with me here. And I'm going to talk briefly about a project that Annalise had working at on the Winooski River. Can you folks see this? Okay. All right. Okay. So this is Mackenzie Park. This is a project that Annalise started several years ago. It was, well, let me go back one. This is, I think most of you know where this is, but this is near the Intervale, and this is along the lower Winooski River right before it dumps into Lake Champlain. So big river, very entrenched, and an area that's used for a lot of food production and has values that mandated that this was an organic situation here, not the typical situation where we're using herbicide glyphosate to suppress the reed canary grass, which we're combating. So we did have a couple things going for us here. Unlike a lot of fields, we had a mature forest next to this field, which meant that we had a seed source that was right on top of us, which makes a big difference. It was wet, but it was easy to get to, and we can really manage this with heavy equipment, which is not always the case, but here we can get tractors into it. The challenges on previous tree plantings were mostly deer browse related. So here is the past planting area where they had a lot of tree planting work, but not a ton of success because of the deer issues. And so they chopped out a small area and said, let's run a trial. So they broke that 500-foot section into two 40-foot wide by 250-foot sections. And to the southern section, they went with just a moldboard plow, just opened the soil, turned it over. And on the north, they did plowing followed by tarping. So very organic, a lot of labor, but let's look at the results. So here's the pre-work. You can see right on top of these mature trees. And they went and put the plow to work and then followed it up with the tarps in August of 2020. And then they uncovered the tarps. The idea of the tarp was to keep that soil not revegetated, right? So this is the same thing you do in your garden, not allow the weeds to come in, so that when they pulled the tarps in June of 2021, after the winter, right before the seeds started to fly on the local forest, it was ready to go. And you can see in June, on June 2nd, she has photos of this cottonwood seed landing right on the soil. And by June 8th, notice it's actually wet. I don't know where they were living in 2021, where everywhere I was, it was dry as a bone. But we start to see success, which is kind of cool, right? This is what it's all about. And I think Will was talking about this earlier. If you can get natural vegetation, you're probably going to overwhelm those deer, and you're probably going to get more of a forest community. So let's see what it looks like just a few months later. So you can see on the right where that tarp was, you have a tremendous, it's a young forest, right? So your density is 10 to 15 stems per square foot. Someone else can do the math on how many that is. Fritz probably knows this off the top of his head. How many is that per acre, Fritz? I bet it's more than 400, but they're very young. They're not there yet. But what we've seen is that the deer haven't really hit them hard. They've hit them, but they can't keep up with it, or they're not interested in keeping up with it. It's kind of like when you put a delicious lobster dinner in front of you. You can only eat one. You can't have 4 lobsters. So we're mostly looking at cottonwood and silver maple, which are the species that we were really shooting for in the first place. So I think what Annalise was hoping to say here was, site selection really does matter on these. You can't just do this everywhere. We've learned at La Platte and Johnson Farm, you can do the exact same work, have the soil type right there where you want it. But if you don't have that seed source, not only the trees right there, but the wind blowing the right way, and that being a mast year, it's not going to work. But if you hit all those magic elements, you can go a long way with not a lot of work. So their plans now are to replicate it in other sections in 2022 and to add some deer fencing and use the monitoring protocol that has been established. Fritz and Annalise have worked on that at La Platte Headwaters and Johnson Farm as well. So that is everything I had to share, and I did it in under 20 minutes. Not bad. Awesome. Tough audience, boy. Look at this crowd. They don't even react. It's just blank stares.
Thank you so much, Pete. So we have at noon, we jump right into the next session. So we have just about 8 minutes for questions if anybody has questions for Pete. I'll keep an eye on the chat too.
If it's all right, I was just going to jump in and just say, just to reiterate that the monitoring is a key component of all of these projects. And Pete and I and Mary Russ at the White River Partnership have been working together to develop a plan for future monitoring so that we can really expand beyond what we're already doing with these specific projects at La Platte Headwaters, Johnson Farm, where we are collecting data both before we start the treatments, but then following for multiple years after the treatments are implemented, so that we can both learn from our mistakes and be able to document and teach others about what works and what doesn't work. But we're, in particular with the White River Partnership, keen to revisit the monitoring of the riparian buffer plantings that was started by Leah many years ago and continued by Annalise several years ago, and expand that to, again, learn lessons that we can disseminate information to other groups working on these restoration projects. So the monitoring is a key element of all of this work. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
Great. Thank you, Fritz. Yeah, that is a really key piece of that, and something that I know I've heard from a lot of folks who are on this call about how critical having monitoring be a piece of the projects is. Do we have any questions for Fritz or Pete in the next 5 minutes or so? Oh, it looks like Todd had one in the chat. He said, in the monitoring, is there a threshold below which additional plantings are needed? For example, underneath 80% survival in Vermont stormwater management?
There's no threshold at this point, to my knowledge. I think. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what, Fritz? I'm going to let you answer this. This is related to tree planting, not necessarily to the work we're doing.
I was hoping you were going with it, Pete, but I think if sometimes funders and possibly NRCS, their staff could speak to this. There are minimum requirements, but I think one of the things that we've learned over the years already is that we kind of all started out with a planting of 300 trees per acre, and I think we've pretty much realized that that's not enough. If we really want to restore these to forest, we need to plant at higher densities. Our kind of normal at CRC is 400 per acre. And if funders will give us more money, we'll plant more than that. Percentage doesn't really work because it depends on what density you plant at in the beginning. But I think you really, I'd love to see 300 or 400 trees per acre surviving after 4 or 5 years. We typically have really high survival for the first couple of years, but then things seem to kind of, depending on the weather and, the last couple of years with droughts, it's been a little more challenging, but, I don't think there's a magic number, but just more getting a density that their canopy will close eventually and start shading out the grass and competing vegetation.
Great. And so then we had a question from Mandy, but it looks like, Pete, did you fully answer that in the chat there? Mandy wanted to know if there's a comparison to a site with prep plus bare root planting to compare to prep plus natural regeneration. And Pete, it looks like you said you have one site with a side-by-side comparison. Is there anything further to add to that answer?
We're working on it. This is part of the process. I don't know that you need to have it side by side. I think you could compare eventually when we get this working well, when we feel like we have it figured out, you could compare them to any site with similar soils, similar tree composition. I don't think you need to have it side by side, but we are working hard on that.
Awesome. And Linda said that she might be able to address some of that question in her presentation, which is coming up in just a second. And then we have, this is probably the last question we have time for. Tom Horton was wondering, is there a book or guide out there that lists species of interest and what kinds of treatments are needed to enhance their germination?
There's what we refer to as the Bible, which is the what is it, USDA, Fritz, that puts out this tree planting or seed guide. I don't know that it gets into that level of detail on what kind of treatments needed to enhance their germination rate, but I can tell you that bare soil is probably the best treatment that would work. So whether it's done with herbicide or with tarps, we all would like to say that herbicide is not something we would like to use, but we did the experiments early on in Barton and discovered that the herbicide really makes a huge difference. We have lots of evidence and lots of data to support that. No books yet. Fritz is going to have to write that. I'm a terrible book writer. I wouldn't put my name on any book unless Fritz wrote it. So it's something we're certainly thinking about, but we're very early in this process, and we're really working on, first of all, figuring out how to keep that seed viable and put it on the ground in a good space, we know how to keep the soils open. We've done a lot of work with that. And we feel like we're very good at changing that natural community from an invasive species like reed canary grass, which is what our focus is, to an herbaceous mix. And I think, the stuff that we did with Katie as well, the Platte Headwaters, shows that you can do that through a number of methods, but the ones that work all seem to be heavy on the herbicide, sadly, unless you want to go to the heavy manual labor that we're seeing with the crop and with the cover. And there has been some talk about using a cover crop, but we haven't gotten quite there yet.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pete. Thanks, Pete and Fritz.